going to make a few political videos in the coming days. I want to discuss the Labour Party in this video and specifically what their goals may be over the next few years. I want to give a disclaimer in this video. I'm not a member of the Labour Party, and I'm not, I don't have any allegiance at this stage to any political party. But the reason I'm focusing on Labour is I do believe they're a major political force. They formed governments before. They're a major political party. And despite the hammering they took on Thursday night, they are still the second largest party, still Her Majesty's opposition. Um, there has been a lot of discussion about A, who the new leader will be, and B, mistakes that Labour made. Today there were a number of developments. Lord Sugar, Alan Sugar, said he's quit the Labour Party. I believe he's been a member of the party since the Tony Blair years. But he said that the party he's tired of the anti-business rhetoric coming from them. I'll touch on that in a minute. The other development was that David Miliband has also weighed in and said his brother made mistakes. Um, Both Lord Mandelson and Tony Blair have also said that Labour made a mistake in going away from the centre. Although Tony Blair also said that he respected Ed Miliband's courage in standing up to vicious personal attacks. Now, there's two things here. There is the sentimental factor and the emotional factor, and the conviction factor. And there is also political reality. Now, the former is that under Ed Miliband, Labour unquestionably moved more to its traditional roots. I know there's hardcore supporters. Um, it seems nothing will please them until you bring Keir Hardie back from the grave, but there is people on the real hardcore traditional wing of Labour who probably Ed Miliband didn't go far enough for them. And there's people who are on the hard political left, like socialist workers and so on, who will, doesn't matter who's leading the Labour Party, they will believe it's a sellout. But I think it's fair to say that any neutral observer would say that Labour definitely moved to the left under the Miliband years. Um, so that is the emotional appeal, the emotional observation that Labour did go more back to its basics, more back to its traditional root roots. But the political reality is that, with the exception of Attlee in 1945, I cannot think of a single Labour Party that has really got elected without moving somewhere near the centre ground. I mean, in the 80s, Neil Kinnock had to stand up to the militant faction because he knew they were weighing down the party's reputation nationally, and he still lost the election. Um, and no party leader in the last 30 years has won a British general election without the endorsement of the Sun. That's a sad reality. It's partly tantamount to how powerful the Sun is, but it also demonstrates that the British, by and large, don't actually endorse those sort of politics of, socialism, to be quite blunt about it. I think there is a very, very strong contingent in British society that favours the centre ground. Um, what's happened in this election is there's still a lot of analysis going on. I think Nick Clegg was right. I think that fear won in this election. I think there were a lot of sort of secret Tory voters who secretly felt ashamed of themselves. That was argued by the Daily Telegraph. So it's a little bit like 1992 in that regard. Um, I think ultimately it was fear. People felt that the Labour Party was going to get in bed with the SNP, despite them saying they wouldn't until they were blue in the face. The Tories kept playing that card, and I believe the Tories are partly responsible for the SNP surge in Scotland, because they stirred up this fear against Labour. Now, obviously, it's politics. Obviously, they're opposing parties, but they made that the central theme of their campaign, and I think it may have worked. I think a lot of people thought, oh, well, Labour's going to get in bed with the Nationalists. Now, in Scotland, whilst the SNP said they wanted a Labour government in Westminster, they went out of the way to say, oh, they're all the same. They're all Westminster establishment. So you had Labour hammered from both sides. Um, when you think about it, it would have made sense for the Lib Dems and Labour to working together would have been obviously not realistic because they're still different political parties. They've got different policies, but both parties got hammered on the same night and both leaders had to resign. But anyway, I won't speak so much about the Lib Dems in this. I want to focus on Labour. Um, some people will criticize David Miliband for speaking out, but the truth is he's going to get criticized whatever he says. If he sort of says that, if he defends his brother and says, "Oh, I think Ed ran a great campaign" and so on, people will know that he's not telling the truth. He's a seasoned politician. They'll say, "Oh, you're just saying that to make your brother look good. You're not being realistic." Whereas what he's saying now, people will say, "You're stabbing your brother in the back, and you're doing this publicly." So I think for either Miliband brother, they can't really win regarding perception because everything they say will be perceived as an attack against the other. People need to remember that just because they're brothers doesn't mean there's any rules against either of them running. So if David Miliband puts his hat into the race, and so far he's indicated they won't do that, but never say never in politics. No doubt there will be people that will criticize that, but why shouldn't he have the opportunity? I believe that in politics, everyone should have the opportunity for to run for a leadership position, and then it's up to the party to decide if they want that person or not. Um, I'm not a Labour supporter, but I have to say that I am swayed by centrist third wave politics. So in Britain nowadays, it's kind of the done thing to vilify Tony Blair's name wherever he goes, and he is a controversial figure, but whatever you think of Tony Blair, you cannot dispute the fact the man won 3 general elections. He's the most successful Labour leader ever in that sense. So, people can scoff and sneer and vilify Tony Blair, but to me that's somewhat peculiar. If you're a member of the Labour Party, I can understand your frustration with the idea that Blair took the party away from socialist roots and much more to the centre. I mean, some people would say he's a closet Tory. I don't agree with that. I think if you look at Blairism, although there's right wing aspects to it, categorizing it as Toryism is very ignorant. And actually, there's many new Labour policies that would be very different from Tory ideology. For example, the big state um, is something that New Labour was very fond of. That's something the Tories are always that is something they put as a central focus that they don't believe in the nanny state in the same sense. So I don't think you can lazily say New Labour and Toryism is the same thing. I think that's just from people on the hard left who hate Tony Blair. Um, no politician in my life has influenced me more than Tony Blair, so I am interested in what he has to say. That doesn't mean that I'm a massive fan of Tony Blair. It doesn't mean I'm slavishly supportive of him. Far from it. There's a lot of things about New Labour I didn't like, but what is obvious is that they knew how to win elections. Part of the problem, or part of the reason they done that, was by cozying up to the Murdoch press in 1997. Now, in their defence, at the time they were under such a level of attack that they had no other choice. I mean, Tony Blair was a realist, and he understood that if Labour didn't make a radical change in terms of how it came across to the electorate, then it just wouldn't get elected. And if you don't get elected, you can't make changes. Now, Nick Clegg is a centrist, and I think he has recognised something similar within the Liberal Democrats. Of course, the story is somewhat different with Nick Clegg because his party suffered enormously. Um, but regarding Labour, New Labour, and so on, I'll say a few things about the perception of Red Ed and his Labour Party being far left. I don't think they were far left at all. I believe they were centre left. But because they were a big political force, and because this was quite an ideological election, more so than any probably in recent years, then it was very easy for the right wing press to portray him as Red Ed. If I was a socialist, I would see that as a compliment to Mr. Miliband. And I still insist that Ed Miliband is a thoroughly decent man. Um, I believe he's a brave man. I believe he's a decent man. That doesn't mean I agree with all of his politics. Uh, I admire anyone who stands up to the Murdoch press. And even the most ardent Tories would have to look at that headline in the Sun and really ask themselves, is this how people should be voting on how a man eats a sandwich? I mean, I'm sure many Tories would have the decency to say, we hate Ed Miliband's policies, but that's a low blow. Um, and this is not about double standards, because I would say the same thing if the Daily Mirror was saying, you know, categorizing David Cameron in a similar sort of way, and they have done that. I don't like those sort of smear tactics in politics, full stop. But Ed Miliband has got more than his fair share of lambasting during this election. He's been ridiculed from day one, was ridiculed from day one. And the problem is, when the Murdoch establishment goes against you, and by establishment, I'm talking about the media faction here, then it does become almost impossible to win an election. You can have good ideas, you can show that you're tough under criticism, you can do everything right, but if the Murdoch establishment stands up against you, you're going to go down. Now, that has been shown. I'm not saying that that headline ultimately resulted in this election outcome, but I do suspect it had an influence. Because quite frankly, a lot of Sun readers are easily swayed. If you're a Sun reader, I'm sorry, but that's my gut feeling. I believe a lot of Sun readers are easily swayed by the trash that they put on their covers. Um, and I'm not saying that's everyone, but it is just an observation. Um, I don't think that the Labour Party under Ed Miliband was far left, but there was aspects of it I didn't particularly like. I mean, I don't like the militant feminism within the Labour Party, but to be fair, I don't think that's something that developed in the Miliband years. I think that's been around. I mean, it was Tony Blair that introduced the Minister for Women and Equalities rather than simply the Ministry of Equality. Um, I mean, I've got strong views on this. I think that that sort of militant feminism is very off-putting to a lot of male voters. And YouGov recently, Peter Kellner of YouGov recently had a piece in, I believe it was the I newspaper or might be in the Times, but basically he said that there are fewer fathers voting for Labour at the moment, and there are a wide range of other demographics, but I wouldn't be surprised. That sort of militant feminism that is very obvious within the Labour Party is, to me, very off-putting because it is not about equality at all. It comes across as very divisive and very arrogant. Um, I think Ed Miliband done everything he could do. He couldn't continue with Blairism because then they would have lost grassroots supporters. And yet, going up against the Murdoch press, it was always going to be difficult to win an election. And yet, coming up to the day, the pollsters were saying they were neck and neck. I genuinely thought a few points Miliband might just get it. And I know that people commenting on my videos thought that he might as well. Um, so I think it is sad what has happened. I mean, I'm not completely melancholy about the Labour situation because I don't agree with all Labour policies, but I don't have as much sort of animosity towards Labour as I do towards Tories. Um, but in reflection, what path is Labour going to take? I mean, it looks almost certain that they'll go back to the centre path, and I imagine there'll be a lot of traditional Labour voters and socialists uh, seething with rage at this. But the reality is that if you take a direction which appears as class war, even if that isn't what it is, if that is strong perception that the public gets, then it's off-putting. Labour did give the impression during this campaign that they were anti-wealth, anti-business, full stop. That's different from saying that you want a fairer society. But what I would say is simply talking about fairness and talking about standing up to exploitation and so on is not the same as being anti-wealth. But the Labour Party under Ed Miliband did give that impression that they were playing class war. Another aspect I didn't like was the constant talk about working people this, working people that. It's very sort of, well, for one thing, it marginalizes unemployed people because it says that if you're unemployed, you sort of shouldn't have a voice, and the Labour Party doesn't care about you. I just don't like the rhetoric that comes from that. The thing that attracted me most to the Liberal Democrats was I don't believe that they pander to any specific group. I believe they're a genuinely a party that genuinely reaches out to everyone. And I just think it's tragic that they had such a demise on the night. Now we have a very divided country, and I think it's very unfortunate. But anyway, who's Labour going to choose as their next leader? A few names have been thrown into the mix. There's Chuka Amuna, there is Jeremy Hunt, there is Dan Jarvis was a name that was speculated. He's a backbencher, but he's already ruled himself out because of he personally doesn't want to do it. David Lammy said he's not interested. He wants to run for Mayor of London, and I think he would be along the lines of Ed Miliband. I think Chuka Amuna and Jeremy Hunt, I think they would be Blairites, and I think that they would move the party back to the centre. So would David Miliband if he decides to run. Um, Harriet Harman, I don't think she's shown interest in being the de facto leader. She's interim leader at the moment, but she's sort of like a grandee of the party. I don't think she's really interested in being leader. Yvette Cooper is Shadow Home Secretary. I've just seen a thing on the this morning program, I think it was, or the Andrew Marr program, with Yvette Cooper arguing with Nick Clegg. She came across as quite rude, I have to say, in that interview. She just kept talking over him and didn't come across very well. Obviously, Mr. Balls, Mr. Miliband, Douglas Alexander, Jim Murphy. There's a lot of senior figures in the party who have either lost their seats or resigned. So Labour has been hit hard. Um, would a Chuka Amuna or Jeremy Hunt leadership be enough to tempt me to endorse Labour? I don't know. I'd have to look at everything. Political parties and their policies is something I do take very seriously. I think a lot of people don't maybe think about policies as much as they should. And I don't want to sound arrogant by saying that, but I just think this is important for everyone. If you vote for a party because you in your heart and soul believe they are the right party, that's great. It's your democratic right, but I think too many people don't really give it a great deal of thought, and that concerns me. That's almost as bad as not voting at all. But for me, I've really mixed views on this because I do think it is important in a country to have left, right, and centre. So if there is a clear left wing party, I don't think that's a bad thing. Because if every party was in the centre, you wouldn't have ideological differences. I'm a centrist. I believe the centre is a good thing. But I do believe it is important to have a clear left and a clear right for a real sense of democratic choice. Um, and what Ed Miliband done was brought the Labour Party more to the traditional left. I mean, a lot of the policies I think were very decent policies based on fairness, like abolishing 0 hours contracts and so on. I am disappointed they didn't include a pledge to abolish workfare, and that's something that was completely ignored in this election. Um, I call myself a centrist, but there's areas that I would be left wing in my thinking, especially on employment issues, workers' rights, that sort of thing. I'd probably be much more on the political left. Um, However, in other areas, it'd be to the centre or the right, and that is where I'm relatively sympathetic to New Labour and New Labour policies. Certainly not everything, far from it, but I grew up with New Labour, and I don't think that Tony Blair is a disaster that people make him out to be, and I think that New Labour done a lot of good things and progressive things, but there was other areas that I couldn't endorse them on. So Tucker Amuna or Jeremy Hunt would probably be if either of those men became leader, I'd seriously look at Labour. I'd look at the policies and look at what that really meant. But what I wouldn't want is, as someone pointed out earlier, just another Tory party or like a watered down Tory party. Labour has to be ideologically different from the Tories. I think it's very possible to be pro business and anti exploitation at the same time. I really do. And that's one thing I like about the Lib Dems again. I think they got the balance quite right. Although I think all the parties could have done a lot more in certain areas of unfairness, especially workfare. None of the major parties cared about that. there is some who want the Labour Party to be like the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, if that happens, Labour is never going to get elected. They're just not, because it's going to be off-putting to a lot of people. And not this is not a case that the British are cold-blooded and are pro-exploitation. I don't think it's necessarily that. It's just that they want a strong economy and they want a country that is seen as stable. Now, if you have the logic of the Socialist Workers' Party, like the hell with the establishment, and I think their message is very divisive. Ultimately, I think you need a good, strong centrist path, and I think that I'd be relatively interested if there was Jeremy Hunt or Chuck Moon in leadership. I'm just mentioning those two guys. There might be others. I'm not sure if Andy Burnham's going to put his name into the mix. Although obviously Burnham's a heavyweight in the Labour Party, I don't actually know that much about him, so I'd have to look a bit more into it. Anyway, that's just my thoughts. I'm not a member of the Labour Party. This is just my thoughts as an outsider. Um, I do respect some of the things that Ed Miliband's Labour Party were talking about. For example, breaking up the Murdoch Empire. That is radical, but it is necessary because the Murdoch Empire has a poisonous influence in this country, and I don't believe it's extreme to say that. I believe it's an observation, and I believe that even the other night during the election, David Dinsmore was invited on to share his thoughts, and David Dimbleby was being really polite and like, "Mr. Dinsmore, what are you thinking?" I'm thinking, for God's sake, why does this guy get any sort of credibility? Why talk to him like he's an honourable figure? He's not. He's a slimy tabloid editor. So it's just my thoughts.